everybody, this is the Pop Music Freak. I am back with another video. Those of you who have been following me know I just did a video in the last few days over the top 100 hits of the Billboard Hot 100 era, which is the week of August 4th, 1958, all the way up to this very day. So you know I'm very much into the charts, and today I am going to cover the top 100 artists to ever chart on the Hot 100 chart in its history. I would be remiss to not take a moment to pay tribute to a man who did a lot to spark my interest in the pop music charts and Billboard and the top 40 and the top 100 and everything. That man's name was Joel Whitburn. He was the writer and publisher of all the books you've seen available that cover the charts, whether it's a different genre or a year or different decades or the Billboard book of top 40 hits and all of that. I spent a lot of money on that man's work, and sadly he just passed away within the last day or two. So I'm paying tribute to Joel Whitburn. He was 82 years old, and he was definitely an important part of one of my very favorite hobbies. So let rest in peace, Joel Whitburn. My condolences to his family and all those that love the charts and respect that man. All right. Now we got that out of the way. We're going to do now the top 100 artists of the Hot 100 era. And I always like to start with number 101 because I always feel bad for the one that just misses the chart. That's just my silliness. But anyway, number 101 on the list is Santana. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to name the biggest hit they ever had on the Hot 100 in their career. So, so Santana just missed the top 100. The biggest hit they ever had was Smooth, which they collaborated with Rob Thomas on. That was from the year 1999. So, Rob Thomas teamed up with them on the great album Supernatural, and Santana had his biggest hit ever with Smooth. So that's number 101, the 101 artist. Now we're up to number 100. Number 100 artist is Neil Sedaka, and the biggest hit he ever had on the charts was his big comeback hit early 1975, Laughter in the Rain. So Neil Sedaka is number 100 on the list. Number 99 is Bob Seger. Bob Seger's biggest hit, he only had one number one hit. It was Shakedown from the Beverly Hills Cop 2 soundtrack in 1987, hit number one, and that's the biggest hit by the number 99 artist in the history of the Hot 100. Now, number 98 is Fleetwood Mac. Of course, their main success was their blockbuster album Rumors in 1977, and the biggest pop single they ever had on the Hot 100 was the number one hit Dreams from 1977. Okay, next we have number 97. It is Dion DiMucci. Originally was Dion and the Belmonts. He decided to record without them in 1961, and his career really took off like a rocket at that point with the number one hit Run Around Sue, which was Dion's biggest hit ever on the Hot 100. Okay, number 96 on the list is Gloria Estefan. She started out, of course, as part of the Miami Sound Machine. Then they decided to put her name out front, Gloria Estefan and the Miami Sound Machine. And then by 1989, it was basically Gloria Estefan and some other backing band that was kind of like the Miami Sound Machine. But anyway, her biggest hit ever on Hot 100 is Anything for You, which hit number one in 1988. Next, we have the combination of what started out as the Jefferson Airplane, which later became the Jefferson Starship by 1975, and later on was just Starship through the 80s. So basically there were three different bands, but the changes weren't that extreme. The only difference between the Airplane and the Starship is they decided to bring their sound up to the 70s sound, but it was basically the same band. But by the end of the 70s, Marty Balin had left to start a solo career, and he was replaced by a very talented singer, Mickey Thomas. So in the 80s, they changed the name to Starship just to show the change in personnel of the band. So now, through all those configurations, the biggest hit they ever had on Hot 100 was We Built the City in 1985. Personally, not my favorite song. But the fans out there decided it was the biggest hit by this group. Alright, so number 95. Next, my friends, number 94, we have Richard Marx, very successful singer of the late 80s into the early 90s. His biggest Hot 100 hit, Right Here Waiting, from 1989. Spent 3 weeks at number 1 in the fall of 89. Okay, number 93, Destiny's Child, of course, Beyonce's original group. Had tremendous success from 1999 through about 2002, 2003. The biggest hit they ever had was Independent Women from late 2000. They were rated number 93 recording act of the Hot 100 era. Of course, Beyonce would go on to have her own successful solo career, which we'll get to. She's later in our countdown. All right, next we have number 92. That's Jennifer Lopez, J-Lo herself. The biggest pop hit she ever had on the Hot 100 was I'm Real, where she sang with Ja Rule. Hit number 1 in 2001. Okay, number 91 on the list is Kelly Clarkson, the very first American Idol champion. Biggest pop hit she had was Since You've Been Gone from 2005. She ranks number 91 among the top artists of the Hot 100 history. Number 90 on the list is James Brown, the godfather of soul. Yes, he had more R&B hits than any artist in history, and had a decent amount of top 40 hits in the USA in the pop chart, but never reached higher than number 3 on the charts with I Got You, I Feel Good from the end of 1965. He ranks number 90 among the pop Hot 100 artists of all time. Next, number 89, Bobby Darin. His biggest hit was the biggest hit of 1959, Mac the Knife. Spent 9 weeks at number 1. Had a pretty good run of hits afterwards. Ranks number 89 in Hot 100 history. Next, number 88, the Everly Brothers. Had several big hits from 1957 straight through to the early part of the 60s. Their biggest hit on Hot 100, Kathy's Clown from 1960. Spent 5 weeks at number 1. Next, we have number 87, Adele. Adele's biggest hit on the Hot 100, Rolling in the Deep from 2011. Had a few mega hits. This was considered pretty much a mega hit, spending 50 weeks on the Hot 100. Of course, Hello had a longer run at number 1, 10 weeks at number 1 compared to 7 weeks for Rolling in the Deep, but Adele spent a huge amount of time in the top 10. Basically, 3/4 of 2011 was in the top 10. So it earned enough points to be considered her biggest Hot 100 hit. Okay, next, number 86 is Heart. Their biggest hit came in the summer of 1987, Alone. Spent 3 weeks at number 1. They also would have hit number 1 with These Dreams a year earlier, 1986. And ranked number 86 in Hot 100 history, the 86th most successful artist. Next, number 85 is Justin Timberlake. His biggest hit from 2007, Sexy Back. He had a very good run with NSYNC and decided to go solo and was bigger as a solo act as NSYNC was. Okay. Next, number 84, Flo Rida. His biggest hit is Low from 2008, featured T-Pain on there, and this was one of the biggest hits of 2008. Next, number 83, Barry Manilow. His biggest hit was I Write the Songs, that started charting at the end of 1975, hit number 1 in January of 1976. He would go on to have 25 top 40 hits and 3 number 1s, and a pretty successful career for someone that was lambasted by the critics all through the years, but he obviously was talented enough to be number 83 on my list of the top Hot 100 artists. Next, number 82, TLC. Their biggest hit record was Creep back in 1994. They also had another huge hit with Waterfalls and No Scrubs, and they had a pretty good run up through basically 2000. So next, we have Linda Ronstadt at number 81 on the list. Her biggest pop hit on the Hot 100 was the duet with Aaron Neville, Don't Know Much, from 1989. But she also hit number 1 with You're No Good in 1975, and hit number 2 with When Will I Be Loved, also from 1975. Number 80 is the Eagles. The Eagles had a big run of hits through the 70s. Biggest hit they had on the Hot 100 is One of These Nights from 1975, but they also hit number 1 with Best of My Love, New Kid in Town, Hotel California, and Heartache Tonight. Excuse me. And basically 1975 through 79 was one of the most popular acts on the charts. Next, at number 79, the Commodores. In 1978, they had their biggest hit, 3 Times Lady. Also hit number 1 with Still at the end of 1979. And of course, Lionel Richie went on to have a very successful solo career in the 80s. Next, we have number 78. That's Paula Abdul. Biggest hit she ever had was Rush Rush in 1991. It spent 5 weeks at number 1, but also had a string of hits a couple of years earlier. Hit number 1 with Straight Up, and Cold Hearted, and Forever Your Girl, and Opposites Attract. She actually had 4 number 1s on one album. And Rush Rush was the title track was the opening track on the next album, which was her biggest hit of all. Next, number 77, Duran Duran. Big act in the 80s into the early 90s. Biggest hit on the Hot 100 was A View to a Kill from the summer of 85. Hit number 1. They also hit number 1 with The Reflex in 1984, and had several other top 5, top 10 hits on their run of hits. Next, number 76, Ray Charles. Biggest hit he ever had was I Can't Stop Loving You from 1962. Spent 5 weeks at number 1. Also won a Grammy for Record of the Year for that year. Ray Charles, number 76. Next, R. Kelly, number 75 on the list. Biggest hit on the Hot 100 was Ignition from 2003, even though Bump and Grind hit number 1, and so did I'm Your Angel, his duet with Celine Dion. I Believe I Can Fly was also another monster hit, but Ignition was the biggest hit of all from 2003. Next, number 74, we have Ricky Nelson, teen idol of the 50s, who had a big run from 1957 till about 1962. Had a bit of a comeback in the early 70s with the song Garden Party. Sadly, he died in a plane crash in the 80s. Biggest hit he had on the Hot 100 was Travelin' Man in 1958. Did have a few hits before the beginning of the Hot 100, but overall comes in at number 74 on our list. Number 73 is Kool The Gang, whose biggest hit, maybe everyone out there can take a guess. What was Kool The Gang's biggest hit? Yes, Celebration, released the end of 1980, hit number 1 early in 1981. Number 73. Next, at number 72, we have Foreigner, very successful rockin' band. Had their first hit in 1977, was still charting as late as 1990. Biggest hit they had on the Hot 100 would be Waiting for a Girl Like You, which spent 10 straight weeks at number 2 on the Hot 100 at the end of 1981, going into the beginning of 82. They also had other big hits like Double Vision and I Want to Know What Love Is and Hot Blooded and Feels Like the First Time. They had a pretty good run. Number 72 on our list. Number 71 of the top artists of the Hot 100 era is Gladys Knight and the Pips, who first a Motown act in the 60s, got as high as number 2 with I Heard It Through the Grapevine. The year before, Marvin Gaye recorded it and took it to number 1. Then in the 70s, they left and went to Buddha Records and had a huge run of hits, including the number 1 hit, Midnight Train to Georgia, which was the biggest hit they ever had in 1973. Number 70 is Bon Jovi, and they had a big run in the 80s into the early 90s, one of the most successful rock bands of the time period. Biggest album they had was Slippery When Wet, and which had contained 2 number 1 hits, You Give Love a Bad Name And the next single, which was the biggest hit ever on the Hot 100, Living on a Prayer from early 1987. Okay, number 69 on the list is Huey Lewis and the News. They started charting in 1981, had their biggest Hot 100 hit in 1986 with Stuck With You, which spent 3 weeks at number 1. Next, we have number 68, it's Three Dog Night. Their biggest hit was the largest hit of 1971, Joy to the World. Between 1969 and 74, had an incredible run of 18 straight top 20 hits. They were hot, red hot in the early 70s. A lot of critics kind of put them down, but at that time they were as huge as you could be. All right, number 67 is Chubby Checker. Of course, the twist. It's hard to think of anything else other than the twist when it comes to Chubby Checker, but it was such a monster hit for him that who can blame you? The first hit number 1 in 1960. Then there was a resurgence in the popularity of the twist in 61 and 62. Actually came back on the charts and hit number 1 again in 1962. So obviously it is the biggest Hot 100 hit for Chubby Checker. Next, at number 66, we have Bobby Vinton. The biggest hit he had was Roses Are Red, My Love from 1962. Very much a popular crooner of the early 60s. Number 66 on our list. Number 65 is Alicia Keys, one of the most successful acts of the 2000s decade. The biggest hit she ever had up to this point is No One, which hit number 1 for 7 weeks. Late 2007 into early 2008. Next, number 64, it's Pink. Pink had many hits from the 2000s into the 2010s. Biggest Hot 100 hit is So What, which hit number 1 in 2010. Next, number 63 is Paul Anka. Has started out as a teen idol, started having hit records in 1957, had a run through the early 60s, then kind of faded out like a lot of acts did through the mid-60s with the British invasion and Motown, totally taking over the charts. He had a big comeback, though, in the mid-1970s, including You Havin' My Baby, which was a big number 1 hit in 1974. But the biggest hit so far in his career has been Lonely Boy from 1959. That's the biggest chart hit, though he had other huge hits like Diana, Put Your Head on My Shoulder, Puppy Love, and, of course, You Havin' My Baby, which I already mentioned. Okay, number 62 is the Black Eyed Peas. From the mid-2000s through the early 2010s. They were very popular, obviously. 2009 was their peak year. They had their 2 biggest hits. First was Boom Boom Pow, which spent 10 weeks at number 1. The next single, I Got a Feeling, was even bigger, going to number 1 for 12 weeks. And is ranked as their biggest Hot 100 hit. Next, we have John Cougar Mellencamp, number 61. Had a very solid run from 1979 through the end of the 80s. His biggest hit, and pretty interesting, that his biggest hit was the number 2 peaking Hurt So Good from 1982. Was slightly bigger than Jack and Diane, which spent 4 weeks at number 1 in 1982. But Hurt So Good spent a longer time in the top 10 and gained more points than Jack and Diane. So with that, he is number 61 on our list. Number 60 is Cher. Now, one of the longest successful careers anyone's ever had. Of course, hitting with Sunny as early as 1965, but also having a solo career from that point on. Had a few number 1s in the 70s, kind of drifted out. Had a comeback towards the end of the 80s, which kept her hit charting until the early 90s, and then she disappeared again, and then came back in 1998 with Believe, what that would end up being the biggest hit of her career, her biggest success on the Hot 100, and one of the biggest hits of all time in the UK. But there she is, the number 60 artist in the history of the Hot 100. Next, number 59, Ed Sheeran had several big hits over the last 10 years, the biggest of which so far is Shape of You, which hit number 1 for 12 weeks in 2017. And He's had many other big hits, but Shape of You is the biggest so far. Number 58 on our list is Nelly, big-time rap artist from down south, from the dirty south. All right, his biggest hit was early on, Dilemma, a duet with Kelly Rowland from 2002. It is his biggest success on the Hot 100 so far. Number 57, we have Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga burst onto the scene in 2008 and has been a mainstay of the pop music scene ever since. Biggest hit was actually her first big hit, Just Dance, from 2008, which hit number 1. So there she is at number 57. Number 56 is Dionne Warwick, the Hal David Burt Bacharach favorite singer. And she had a major run from the 1960s into the early 70s, had a comeback at the end of the 70s, had a good run in the 80s with Arista Records, capped off by her biggest hit, her charity single, That's What Friends Are For, that she recorded with Stevie Wonder, Gladys Knight, and Elton John. That hit, which hit number 1 for 4 weeks at the end of 85 into early 86. And that is her biggest hit so far on the Hot 100. Bruno Mars is number 55. His biggest hit, not surprisingly, is teaming up with Mark Ronson on Uptown Funk. It was the biggest hit of 2015 and one of the biggest hits of all time. Bruno Mars, number 55 on the list. Next, number 54 is Chris Brown. Started charting in 2006 and has been pretty steady recording artist for the next decade after that. His biggest hit is Run It from 2006. Next, at number 53, it's Kanye West. Gold Digger was his biggest hit. His team up with Jamie Foxx back in 2005. Next, number 52, Bryan Adams. His biggest hit is from 1991. It's Everything I Do It For You. But he also hit number 1 with Heaven and All For Love with Sting and Rod Stewart. Next, Post Malone, including what he's done this week with currently 10 new songs on the Hot 100 from his new record this week. Points from that have pushed him to number 51. Circles is his biggest hit so far. That was from 2018. Number 50 is Connie Francis, probably the most successful female act of the late 50s into the early 60s. Although Brenda Lee gave her a big run in the early 60s, and we'll get to her in a minute. Connie Francis' biggest hit is My Heart Has a Mind of Its Own in 1960. It also hit with Somebody's Fool that year. So her 2 biggest hits were 1960. Next, number 49 is Brenda Lee, which I just mentioned. She at the same time pretty much had her huge run of success. I'm Sorry is Brenda Lee's biggest hit up to this point. Although Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree is gaining quickly in points and may surpass it in the next couple of years. That would be pretty interesting if the Christmas song ends up being her biggest hit. Next we have number 48, that's the Carpenters. Of course, megastars of the early 70s. That seems to be that their first huge hit is standing up to be her biggest. That was the Hal David Burt Bacharach song, They Long to Be Close to You, which spent 4 weeks at number 1 in 1970. That's their biggest hit in their career in the Hot 100. Number 47 is Kenny Rogers. What a huge run he's had. Starting out with his group, The First Edition, which had several hits in the late 60s into the early 70s. Then he took a few years away from the music business, started a solo career that was mega successful, including one of the biggest hits of 1980, his song Lionel Richie penned Lady, which is the biggest hit Kenny Rogers has had on the Hot 100. Anyway, number 46, it's the Jacksons / Jackson 5. So counting the points from both acts together. The only difference was that basically Jermaine left the group when they became the Jacksons. Their biggest hit was 1970's I'll Be There, which spent 5 weeks at number 1. Number 45 is Ariana Grande. She's had several huge hits over the last, say, 7 to 8 years. Biggest she's had is teaming up with The Weeknd on Save Your Tears, which ended up being the number 2 single of 2021. It's the biggest success she's had so far on the Hot 100. Next, number 44, we have The Miracles. Their biggest hit, Stevie Wonder wrote The Tears of a Clown in 1970. Smokey Robinson was, of course, the main cog of that group until he left to go solo around 1973. Next, Beyonce is number 43 on our list. She had many, many hits, especially with Jay-Z, but some of her work on her own was huge, including her very biggest hit, Irreplaceable, which was the number 1 single of 2007. Next, number 42 is Jay-Z, and his biggest single on the Hot 100 is Crazy in Love with Beyonce from 2003. But he's had more hits, including Empire, State of Mind, and some other monster hits. So he's just a nose ahead of Beyonce at number 42. Number 41 on our list is Boyz II Men. What can be said about this group between 1991 and 1997? They had a big run with several mega hits, biggest of which was I'll Make Love to You, which spent 14 weeks at number 1 back in 1994. Next at number 40, it's Barbra Streisand. Her biggest hit, The Way We Were, was the number 1 single of the year 1974. Number 39 on the list is The Temptations, one of the biggest Motown acts. Their biggest hit on the Hot 100 is I Can't Get Next to You from 1969, but they also hit number 1 with My Girl, Just My Imagination, and Papa Was a Rolling Stone. Number 38, The Beach Boys. 1962 through about 1967, they were one of the most popular American groups. The biggest hit on the Hot 100 was I Get Around, but they also hit number 1 with Help Me Rhonda, Good Vibrations, and several other large hits that hit number 2 and 3 on the charts. So they had a very good run. Then it kind of faded out towards the end of the 60s, but have always been somewhat semi in the public eye. Forgot to mention Kokomo, their last number 1 from 1988, but personally, I'd like to focus on the earlier hits, if you don't mind. Anyway, let's go. Number 37 on the list is Neil Diamond. Had a very long, successful career. First hit came in 1966 with Cherry Cherry. His first number 1 was Cracklin' Rosie in 1970. Biggest hit he has had in his career on the Hot 100 so far, You Don't Bring Me Flowers, his duet with Barbra Streisand from 1978. Next, number 36, The Four Seasons. Another act who had huge success in the early to mid-60s, kind of faded out and came back strong in the 70s, of course. Biggest hit they've had in their career was Big Girls Don't Cry from 1962, although it's worth mentioning that Sherry and Walk Like a Man and December 1963, or What a Night, were all number 1 hits, and pretty big ones as well. Number 35 on the list is The Weeknd, one of the younger acts to jump very high on our list. For obvious reasons, he has had tremendous success with some singles. Just in the last 2 years alone, he had, of course, the song that we mentioned earlier that was Ariana Grande's biggest hit, Save Your Tears, was the number 2 single of 2021. His song Blinding Lights was the number 1 single of 2020 and the number 3 single of 2021. It gained enough points to be the all-time leader on the Hot 100 charts. The biggest hit ever. Blinding Lights, obviously, is his biggest hit ever. Okay. Number 34 on the list, Billy Joel. What can be said about the Piano Man that hasn't been said already? One of the most genius songwriters and very successful careers. On the Hot 100, It's Still Rock and Roll, to me, ranks as his biggest hit from 1980. It spent 2 weeks at number 1. Number 33 is Eminem, one of the most successful rappers of all time. Just elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this year. His biggest hit on the Hot 100 so far is Lose Yourself from 2002. He spent 12 weeks at number 1. Number 32 on the list is Lionel Richie, who, of course, had a very successful career with the Commodores, as I mentioned earlier, and had an even bigger solo career. Biggest hit he's had is actually a duet with Diana Ross, Endless Love from 1981, but ended up having a string of 9 years in a row writing a number 1 hit, which is a pretty impressive stat. All right, number 31 on our list is Donna Summer, the number 1 act in the history of the disco era. Certainly had several number 1s, the biggest of which was Hot Stuff from summer of 1979. But she also hit number 1 with MacArthur Park and Bad Girls and No More Tears, Enough's Enough with Barbra Streisand. So 79 was her big year, and definitely go down in memory as the queen of disco. Even though they had given that crown to Gloria Gaynor early on, Donna Summer took control of that. Certainly. All right, we're in the top 30 now. Number 30 is Phil Collins. Besides his huge career with Genesis, he had an even bigger career as a solo act. The biggest hit, Another Day in Paradise, spent 4 weeks at number 1 in December 1989, going into January 1990. Phil Collins is number. Next, we have artist number 29. It's Diana Ross. Of course, she had a tremendous career with the Supremes, having 12 number 1s with them. We'll get to them a little later. But here, her solo career was pretty sizable in itself with 6 number 1s, including the aforementioned Endless Love that she duetted with Lionel Richie from 1981. That is her biggest hit outside of the Supremes. Next, number 28, we have Justin Bieber, one of the biggest stars of the last decade and a half. His biggest hit is teaming up with the Kid Laroi on Stay, which is now ranked as the number 3 single in the history of the Hot 100. So Justin Bieber, number 28 as an artist on the Hot 100. Number 27 is the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin. Had an amazing career. Actually had her first hits as early as 1960, but didn't really take off in a huge way until 1967 when she went to Atlantic Records. Seemed that they knew exactly what to do with her and turned her into a superstar and one of the greatest R&B performers ever. On our list, she is number 27. Biggest hit she ever had was teaming up with George Michael on I Knew You Were Waiting for Me, which hit number 1 in 1987. She also hit number 1 in 1967 with Respect. That's Aretha Franklin. Next, number 26, we have Katy Perry, one of the biggest stars in pop music in the last 15 years. Had a total of 9 number 1 singles, biggest of which is Dark Horse from 2013. Spent 7 weeks at number 1. Next, number 25, Marvin Gaye, another Motown legend. His biggest hit was this version of I Heard It Through a Grapevine. Hit number 1 for 7 weeks, from December 68 into January of 69. An all-time legend for sure. Next, number 24, Rod Stewart. His biggest hit from the end of 1976 was Tonight's the Night, Gonna Be Alright. Had a big career. Also hit number 1 with Maggie May, Do You Think I'm Sexy, and All for Love with Bryan Adams and Sting. Number 23 is Maroon 5. They, believe it or not, have been charting since 2004. It's an 18-year run, and have had many, many big hits. The biggest of which, Girls Like You from 2018. Number 22 is Taylor Swift, another artist who has been around quite a long time. She started charting in 2006 and is still going strong. Her biggest hit was the 2014 smash, Shake It Off. Next, number 21, Olivia Newton-John. Had a great, successful career. Started out with more of a country-tinged artist, a country pop artist. Became very successful balladeer thanks to the song I Honestly Love You in 1974, which was her first number 1 hit. But her biggest hit of all, Let's Get Physical. 10 weeks at number 1, end of 81 into the beginning of 82. This has been her biggest hit. Another artist that I'm wondering why they're ignoring her for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think she's more deserving than just about anybody. But anyway, I'll get off the soapbox now. And go to the number 20 artists on the list. That's Daryl Hall and John Oates. Had a big run of hits from 1976, pretty much straight through till near the end of the 80s. Their biggest hit, 1982's Man Eater, spent 4 weeks at number 1. Number 19, But When Doves Cry, was the biggest single for Prince, spending 5 weeks at number 1 in 1984. Number 18, we're combining Wham with George Michael's solo career, because basically Wham was him, and just one other guy, Andrew Ridgeley. But you put them together, and then George Michael had an amazing run from basically 1984 straight into the early 90s. One More Try from 1988 is his biggest chart hit so far. George Michael and Wham together. Number 17 is Chicago, one of the longest running successful acts there's ever been, hitting the top 40 for the first time in 1970 and still charting as late as 1991. Their biggest hit out of all their hits was Hard to Say I'm Sorry from 1982. David Foster produced song, spending 2 weeks at number 1 in the summer of 82. Number 16 is the Supremes with Diana Ross and Mary Wilson and Flo Ballard. Were among the most successful acts of the 60s. Basically went hit for hit against the Beatles for dominance of the charts. 1964's Baby Love was the biggest hit they've had, and they are ranked number 16 among the artists of the Hot 100 era. Number 15 is the Bee Gees. Don't even have to get into all the disco of the 70s, but the truth is they had hits going back a decade before that. Very pop rock oriented group with a sound that kind of reminded people of middle era Beatles. But of course, their biggest run wouldn't start till 1975, when they decided to go more into an R&B disco direction, and the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack supplied all 3 of their biggest hits. Biggest we have in ranking on the Hot 100, How Deep Is Your Love from 1977. So Bee Gees are ranked number 15 on our artist list. Number 14 is Usher. 2004 was pretty much his biggest year. He had 3 of the top 5 hits that year, including the number 1, Yeah, which spent 11 weeks at number 1. Number 13 is the Rolling Stones, another act that had a huge amount of longevity, charting from 1964 straight through to the early 90s. Had many hits, and the biggest of which was Honky Tonk Women from 1969. Number 12 is Drake. Drake has the record for all acts that are not the Glee Club having Hot 100 hits. He had over 200 Hot 100 hits so far, the biggest of which, God's Plan, was the number 1 single of 2018. Drake is ranked number 12. Number 11 is Rihanna. Rihanna has had 14 number 1 hits on the Hot 100, biggest of which, We Found Love, her collaboration with Calvin Harris from 2011. Now we are in the top 10 artists in Hot 100 history. One artist is involved in 2 of the 10 acts. I'm talking about, of course, Paul McCartney. Number 10 for his solo career, his career outside of the Beatles. He had 9 number 1 hits outside of the Beatles, the biggest of which, Say, 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 his collaboration with Michael Jackson in 1983, which spent 6 weeks at number 1, is ranked, helps Paul McCartney be ranked the number 10 artist of Hot 100 history. Number 9 is Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston has had 11 number 1 hits, the biggest of which was I Will Always Love You, which ended up being ranked the number 1 single of 1993, spending 14 weeks at number 1. Number 8 is Janet Jackson, who has had a huge run for a decade, from 86 to 96, had almost as many hits as her brother or anyone else on the charts. Miss You Much from 1989 was Janet's biggest hit. Number 7, Michael Jackson. Of course, his biggest hit is Paul McCartney's biggest hit, Say, 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 from 1983. But of course, Billie Jean was huge as well, along with Ben, Rock With You, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, and a total of 13 number one singles for MJ, the king of pop. Number 6, Stevie Wonder. Also had his biggest hit be a collaboration with Paul McCartney. Ebony and Ivory from 1982 spent 7 weeks at the top, but of course Stevie Wonder had 8 other number one hits and has had an amazing career. Number 5 is Elvis Presley. Now, let me just do a quick explanation. Elvis Presley actually started charting early in 1956, which is 2 years before the Hot 100 began. And if you want to rank the biggest artists of that period, Elvis Presley blows everyone away. You include those points, Elvis Presley would be easily number 1 on this list. But since the Hot 100 chart began in August of 1958, it was after most of his big hits. So what he did afterwards was still amazing enough for him to be ranked number 5. The biggest hit since 1958 is Are You Lonesome Tonight from 1960, which spent 6 weeks at number 1. But yeah, asterisk next to his name, because in reality, he was the biggest thing ever for the first 2.5 years of the rock era. Next, Elton John, number 4. One of the longest, most successful careers anyone's ever had. First charted in 1970 and is on the charts right now. 52 years later, he's still on the charts. Anyway, number 4, Candle in the Wind 1997 is his biggest hit, which spent 11 weeks at number 1 and is one of the biggest selling singles of all time. Number 3, Mariah Carey, 19 number 1 hits. Only the Beatles have more in the Hot 100 era, one more. And is the only artist to have a Christmas song hit number 1 on the U.S. charts, of course. And that will keep revisiting. It's been number 1 for 3 years. 3 Christmas seasons. How many years will it go? And definitely will help contribute on her trying to get to number 2 or number 1 on this list. We Belong Together is Mariah Carey's biggest hit from 2005, although One Sweet Day is a very close second. Her duet with Boyz II Men. Next, number 2, Madonna. 11 number 1 hits. A very successful long career. First charted in 1983 and is charted into the 2000s. Like a Virgin, to this point, is her biggest hit, spending 6 weeks at number 1. Would end up being the number 1 single of 1985. Now we're here. Number 1. 20 number 1 singles. The only act ever to have the whole top 5 of the charts for a week. What else can I say about the Fab Four, the Beatles? They have withstood a lot of challenges. There's several acts that are within range of catching up to them at some point in the future, but they're still number 1. Hey Jude is their biggest hit. Spent 9 weeks at number 1 in 1968 and was the biggest hit of the 1960s, by the biggest act of the 1960s and the biggest act in the history of the Hot 100 to date. We'll see if they hang on to that crown. But it's been fun to do. This is the top 100 artists in Hot 100 history. I hope you enjoyed it. Let the debate begin. I know some people can kind of complain that some artists are a lot lower than they should be, and other artists are a lot higher than they should be. Have fun. All I ask of you is to please subscribe. Please climb aboard. I have a lot more, many more videos to do. And it's not all going to be countdowns. There's going to be reaction videos. There's going to be a lot of stuff I hope you enjoy. So please share this video. Please subscribe. Please like it. And thank you all so much. Peace and love.